all the time. Now, that's not acceptable in the in the real world out there. We shouldn't have anywhere near that many genetic defects spread through the whole gene pool. It just doesn't make sense. More importantly, we have a couple of dozen that will kill you, that are genetic defects that you can see pop up anywhere in the human species, that will kill you before you reach the age of maturity. So that means that we are all carrying those genetic defects, the gene pool is, and yet there is no mechanism for passing those genetic defects into the gene pool in the first place, because everybody that gets it dies before maturity. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, wait a minute, how do those things...
Where did we pick up the baggage?
Where did we pick them up? How did that happen? And, of course, the only answer is that they were engineered into us, that the only way that can happen is through genetic engineering. Now, you won't get any geneticists that will acknowledge this because that's tantamount to saying we are an engineered species. But anybody that looks into it with any depth of sincerity and effort immediately bangs up against that conundrum that just can't be answered. If we are a naturally evolved species, we shouldn't have anywhere near 4,000 genetic disorders, and we shouldn't have even one that kills everybody before the age of maturity, because there's no way to pass that along.
That's right.
So right there, if you want to just say, well, are we a genetically engineered species or not? Right there, you don't have to look any further. But of course, again, that is not going to be accepted as valid information.
And there are going to be, in my mind, watershed events. That is the reason why Starchild really caught my eye. And there's a couple of questions I wanted to ask you about it. You did a beautiful job of describing the anatomical detail of the skull. Let's take that a next step forward. Based on the anatomical details, tell me about what you think that person's five senses would have been. Would they have been more likely to break bones? Would they have been agile? In other words, physically and in terms of their senses, how would that child have differed from a human child of the same exact age?
Well, before we get into that, I need to point out that the Starchild is actually not a child. It was a full-grown adult of some kind. The reason for the mistake came early on when we first consulted with experts about it. The Starchild came with a piece of detached maxilla, upper right maxilla, which is your upper jaw. And in that piece, you had two teeth sticking down, and you had teeth up in the bone ready to come down. So the assumption automatically was that it's a child because it was small, and though it was very weird looking, it was smaller than a normal adult skull, and so ipso facto, child. And so we started calling it the Starchild. Later, experts examining that maxilla and the teeth sticking down said, no, these teeth have a wear pattern on them that indicate anywhere from 20 years or more. So the question then became, well, what are well-worn teeth doing in the mouth if there are teeth above? And the answer was, we don't know. That's another of the questions that you have to deal with. Also, too, other experts looking at the rear of the skull, looking at what are called islands, which are the connective bone, pieces of bone between the growth points at suture lines. There were some islands in the rear of the head that indicated to those experts that it was also a fully grown adult, at least in the 20 to 30 year range. So this was not something that was born deformed and died young, as a lot of people early thought. It grew and it survived and it thrived for quite some time, looking as weird as it did and having all of its attributes as strange as they were. Now, to answer the question about what did it look like, the woman who found the...
Excuse me, can I interrupt for a second? Burning question here, because in terms of, we're saying that it was not a child, it was an adult of 20 years. But what if it's a completely different species and it takes them a whole lot longer to mature than we do?
Well, one of the
20-year-old child for a different species, like dogs
Right.
live to be 10 years old.
Well, when we say 20 years, Marshall, that's only as we judge age. And another factor is the fact that the teeth were down and worn and had crazing in the enamel, which indicates some strenuous use over a long period of time. But the teeth are coming down. There are more teeth to come. So one of the obvious answers is this is a being that lives 300 or 400 years and needs, several sets of teeth to cycle through and go out. I mean, that certainly would be a possibility. Another strange thing about it is the durability of the bone itself, the bone in the skull itself. We haven't touched on this yet, but this might have something to do with the age issue. Mm-hmm. The skull the Starchild's bone is half as thick as normal, weighs half as much, and yet it's 2 or 3 or 4 times as hard. One of the tests that we need to do now in the near future, as soon as we can get the money to do it, is to test how hard it is relative to normal human bone. We don't know. We don't have a 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. We just know that it's an awful lot harder. So if that bone is so durable, who knows? Maybe that species or the hybridized species lived vastly longer than normal humans live. Who knows?
So we have this extraterrestrial skull of a being that could live to be 300 years old.
Possible or presumed extraterrestrial skull. We know now because of the genetic studies that we have been able to do that its mother was a human being. Now, we always assumed that from the beginning. We've assumed that the Starchild was the result of a hybridization. The reason we made that assumption is the parts of a human skull are there. You have a frontal bone, you have 2 sphenoids, you have 2 temporals, you have 2 parietals, and you have an occipital. You have the parts. But the parts have been completely rearranged in their shape, but not in their positioning per se relative to each other, but in their positioning relative to a human. Yes, they're different in every way. They're different in their configuration. They're different in their context, what they're made of. So while the parts are the same, there's a complete redesign going on here. So we've assumed that in some way human beings are involved in that creature. If it is a hybridization, then the mother.
Would they have been, just looking at the biological aspect, would this have been a natural copulation, or
that would be unlikely to get as big a jump from human to this thing? So natural copulation seems unlikely, but genetic manipulation, it would be possible to get that kind of a leap in the way that we're a leap from everything that came before us. If you look at the difference between us and the primates that we supposedly, quote, descend from, there's no line of descent whatsoever. You have primates and you have us, and there's this huge leap between the two. Well, there's a similarly huge leap between humans and whatever the Starchild was. So that's only done with genetic engineering. Now, if that's the case, then the female of the pair has to be human. You have to use a human egg.
So it's a human ova. Okay.
Yeah,
and
you have to use
that there's a human ova and it's a non-human sperm.
If indeed that was how it was done, the ovum would have to be adjusted so that it would be able to receive the sperm and be able to make, a living zygote and move on from there.
Well, then this implies that there had to be extensive technology, because in vitro, first off, the woman has to have her ovary prepared.
Her ovum prepared, right?
Her ovum prepared, has to be harvested and prepared. It requires injections. I mean, it's just not simple test tube. I mean, that's a very small part of an in vitro process.
Right.
There's a lot of other things that have to go on. So that again implies that.
Well, if you make the assumption that the apparently ongoing practice of what's called harvesting in UFO circles, there is a practice called harvesting.